thing to do is to basically shut up and not have a bunch of people facing consequences that they didn't ask for in the first place. So with that, but I'm glad you asked that question. That is a good question, and I probably thought more about that question than I think about whether this stock or that stock is cheap. And with that, we'll go to, let's see, that was station 4. We'll go back to Becky.
On that note, let's go to a question from David Cass. He writes in, President Biden's fiscal 2023 budget request would impose a 20% minimum tax on the unrealized capital gains for households worth at least $100 million. What are your views on this issue? And if you don't want to answer, maybe Charlie does.
Well, we'll find out. And we should, in all honesty, we should both say that we would be affected by it. If it's 100 million, we'd both be affected. So our point of view is, and I have no point of view. Charlie, I have no point of view that I would want to attribute it to.
I tend to stay out of the
We're live again
income
here,
tax
folks.
things like this. My policy is
going
I pay
back to
whatever
the
taxes
live
they pass, and I don't want
watching
to
Berkshire Hathaway
engage in lobbying
2022.
about taxes.
If you have any comments, concerns, an audio, video, just make a note in the live stream. We'll be commentating throughout the event. This is post lunch. Berkshire Hathaway 2022. Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett.
I once did it for a candidate, and I ended up in a room with a bunch of lobbyists for cigarette companies. They didn't care about Nebraska. They didn't care about it. They didn't have anything. They were there because they were handing over a contribution. They didn't, and I was a convenient accessory, and it made you want to throw up, basically. On the other hand, we operate in the railroad business, energy business, insurance business, and they're extensively regulated. And I don't also want to be the only railroad that stays out of the railroad group, the only insurance company that stays out of the insurance group. So, other people can rightly figure that we're a free rider under those circumstances. So I tell the managers generally, don't spend Berkshire's money on candidates that you like. Don't pressure suppliers to do it. I mean, Berkshire is not a weapon to use, and it's been used by certain people in the organization. But don't use it to muscle money out of anybody else for who you like or what school your wife went to or whatever it may be. And some of it goes on anyway. But I don't tell our people that don't belong to any trade associations. Charlie wrote one of the great letters of all time. And if you go to search, type in, I think, 1989 Munger savings and loan or something. We resigned from the U.S. Savings and Loan League, I guess it was. And we warned them. We said, we just cannot stand, what you're doing to the country. And what a bunch of very nice people get together, but they decide it's in the interest of their savings and loan to do this or that. And we warned them, and finally Charlie wrote a letter, which is, like I say, available on search. And it's should be one of the proudest letters, certainly one of the proudest letters that's ever come out of Berkshire. And he just said, we can't stand it anymore, and we're resigning. And but that's a very tough thing to do. You can't. It's a tough way to live, to just go around criticizing the people you work with and the neighbors, and they're perfectly decent people, but they run into institutions that are doing things that are very distasteful to them, and we support some of our subsidiaries in energy, and I don't want to find people who are doing it for personal reasons. I mean, in that case, they're in trouble. But I don't say they can't do it because I don't want their hands tied if something comes up, and essentially either they're competitors within the industry or the industry versus this. We're not going to stand alone and say, well, we're morally superior to us, so you put your money up and fight it. So that's where I end up. Charlie?
I've got nothing to add.
Okay. It never bothers me when I don't have anything to add, but he seems stuck on that. Anyway, Becky, did that come from you?
It did.
Yeah, okay. Then station 5.
Oh, thank you, Warren and Charlie. My name is Chong Yao. I'm from China and now studying in the University of Chicago. I really admire you two, especially Charlie. You are my idol since I was a child. And my question is also for Charlie. My question is how to practice the multidisciplinary framework in making investment decisions and in life. Like how to make it more practical. Thank you.
Charlie?
Well, obviously, it helps you to know more than one discipline. There's an old saying, that a man who carries only a hammer thinks everything else is a nail. And you make a lot of wrong decisions if you don't have some command of all the disciplines. That's all I ever said. But you do irritate people terribly when you come into their territory. You say, I'm multidisciplinary, you're the expert, and I know better than you. They hate you for it. I can attest to it. I've done it several times.
Yeah, and China, well, there's a certain degree in they have a culture that to some extent reveres age. So Charlie's got me beat. I don't even try and compete with him on China. I can't catch him on age. Okay. I'm going to try to, though. Let's see. We've got Becky coming next.
This question comes from Philip King. He writes, in the 70s, you wrote an article entitled, How Inflation Swindles the Equity Investor. You said that stocks cannot keep pace with inflation because companies cannot increase the return on equity. Do you believe that this is still the case?
Yeah, and of course, bonds can swindle the equity investor too. Everything, inflation, I should say, swindles the bond investor too, and it swindles the person who keeps their cash under their mattress. It swindles almost everybody, and the problem, if you have a business that doesn't take any capital, and let's just say the dollar depreciates 90% or something, so things cost 10 times as much. If it doesn't take any capital, you can charge 10 times as much, and you've kept your relative position. But most businesses take some capital. If our utility business, just say that the dollar is worth 1/10, some years hence from now, we have to have 10 times the capital investment, basically. And we get paid a return on that. But we have forced capital investment to essentially keep them in the same place. And I wrote an article that related to that. And I will tell you one famous story, which you will all sympathize with. And that I wrote that story for Fortune. And when I finished it, it was about 7,000 words. And Fortune didn't like publishing 7,000 words. And they had my friend Carol Loomis explain that to me, knowing that I would pay more attention to her than anybody else. But being stubborn and male, I said, every word is precious. And they can either run it or not. So then they sent an editor, a very nice guy, out to Omaha. And this guy explained to me that it just wasn't right to use that many words. And I said, well, that's fine, but if you don't do it, I'll write it someplace else or something. Very disgusting behavior on my part. And then I sent it. It was beginning to bother me a little. So I sent it to my friend Meg Greenfield. And Meg was a great, great, great editor at the Washington Post. And we were very, very good friends. Wonderful woman. And Meg, who was tough as nails with most writers, but she was kind of nice. She didn't want to really hurt me too much. So I said, well, Meg, what do you think? And she said, well, Warren, she says, you don't have to tell everything you know in this article. and it made the point. And so I write that article shorter, and but I'd say more or less the same thing. No, you're better off if you really could have a totally stable unit of monetary use for the next 100 years. It would be better for business and investors in general. Charlie? Well, we will go to Station 6. Inflation is, the question is how much, and the question is whether you can decide that 2% and keep it. The answer is nobody knows. I mean, you do not know, and nobody knows. You can list all kinds of stuff, but nobody knows how much inflation there will be over the next 10 years or 20 years or 50 years or next month. And people talk about it all the time because you're interested in knowing the answer to your question. And they don't know the answer, but there are a lot of people that will tell you they know the answer if you pay them enough, and other people that will tell you for nothing because they think it enhances their prestige and makes them more valuable and all that. But the answer is they don't know, and we don't know either. The best protection against inflation, though, still is your own personal earning power. If you play the violin very well, you will do reasonably well during inflation. I mean, it's play it better than other people. People will pay you for doing that. If all kinds of things. So your skills will not be taken away, and your money may be. Okay, Station 6. Oh, wait a second. Was it Becky next? Becky?
It's Station 6.
Yeah, Station 6, okay.
My name is Martin Wiegand. I live in Nashville, Tennessee. Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger, thank you for your lifetime of teachings and for hosting us back in Omaha this year.
Well, thank you.
You have mentioned that companies get the shareholders they deserve. And in this year's letter, you mentioned a great satisfaction of yours is working for the individual long-term shareholders. With the growing influence of institutional index funds, how can management teams foster a shareholder culture like the one we have at Berkshire? Thank you.
Well, fortunately, we have it, and we know more about how to keep it than to institute one. And it's very interesting. We have 1,470,000 Class A shares outstanding today. That's fewer than we had a year ago in there. Those seats are filled. I mean, the shareholders are in place. We like the group we have. So why in the world, when we got a fixed number of seats, should we go out and recruit other people to replace you? I mean, the ideal shareholder group we can have is the group we have today. And why, we had a church, we'd want the people to keep coming back week after week after week. If we had a limited number of seats and we had some wonderful parishioners, and we would not go out and recruit another 50 or 100 of them and have to throw out 50 or 100 of the ones we already had. We've got, and every company I know virtually, is wooing new people to come in, and whether they're improving the group they get or not is another. I mean, it strikes us as basically crazy. We don't want anybody different than we have now, and we're not going to get rid of the index funds, so we have to get rid of people like you, and we don't want to get rid of people like you. And I just don't understand why if you had a neighborhood and you had not, and the size of the terrain or whatever it was would be such that you could have 10 of the guy next to me. It is weird, but there's an awful lot of people who make their living by doing that, and they never really question. I would sort of ask any company that's making analyst presentations every month or something, which of the present ones are you trying to get rid of? Basically, because you're not going to have more. I hope you're not going to have more shares outstanding at the end of the year than you have now. And am I supposed to, get out of the way so some other fund that is thinking about what your stock is going to do next week replaces me? It is a very, very, very weird situation. And of course, the really crazy process that has developed is people talking to, we'll say, analyst group, the sort of the high priests of finance. Some companies are doing it more than once a month. Well, just imagine if you work for that company, you go to work for that company, and every month people are repeating these things about their company, that it's important that we have more services per customer, and it's 6.2, and we got to get to 7 or something like that. And they'd say that month after month after month. It becomes a catechism. And CEO says it, or his or her representative says it, and it goes, how do you go on the next month and say, by the way, we were really wrong, and this is what we should be working on? You don't say that. And it's a terrible problem that the new CEO has, coming in after a previous CEO has said the important thing to do is to hit your earnings targets. Well, he's been meeting them in all probability by cheating from time to time. And this guy hands you the baton, and are you going to come out and say, well, we've really been cheating a little, and it's really counterproductive to the development of the companies, not to make earnings projections and just to give you the results as they come, rather than making up a few things in the accounting department? They can't do it. You can't. It's not human nature. And besides, you wouldn't get appointed as a successor, but you just don't go in and say, we've been perpetuating these myths that we can always deliver 8% growth, or we can do this or do that, or that the most important thing is this. You can't go in and change that if every month you've been preaching to people that this is what we stand for, and just ask another question and carry this message out to the masses, to the analysts and all that. And it's a totally destructive policy. I mean, I can within GAAP accounting and I can play a lot of games with numbers. We've done a lot of dumb things at Berkshire. We have never told anybody that the number had to be this or that or to change anything. I mean, it just, once you start it, it's all over. You can't quit. It's like taking $5 out of the cash register. The first time you take the $5 out, you say, well, I'm going to put it back. And then do it a few times and you'll never stop. In fact, do it once and you probably never stop. But it's if something is going to be destructive, the thing to do is not start it. And forecasting earnings, I can't imagine anything more destructive. I got 360,000 people out there, and they know whether I'm lying or not, a good many of them. And they know if they send in figures and they get changed, what message are you telling them? We've got one dramatic illustration of that within Berkshire, and it's just, we want to. If you start lying, you got a big problem. It's that simple. And if you start saying to your team that somehow you got a job, you got shareholder relations, your job is to go out and tell everybody that our stock is the best thing among thousands of choices to buy every day. Well, that's crazy. And so what do you tell them? Well, they try to, see which way the wind is blowing and figure out what they have to tell people. And then they go out and tell them. And then if you're a human and you said we're going to earn $3.59 a share, you can get to $3.59. You can get there quite a while. And, you can have audit committee, you have all these processes. But if you have a culture of lying, the processes really don't, they just disappear. And Charlie and I have seen it, well, practically every time we've gone on a board. But, Charlie, tell them about it.
Well, I think Berkshire's culture is going to last a long time after we're gone. And I think it should, and I think it'll prosper pretty well. The rest of corporate America is quite different. And it gets more different, I think, with each passing decade. And it's getting very peculiar. Pretty soon they're going to hold all the shareholders meetings online, and the shareholders won't even come. And it's getting very peculiar, and the index funds get more and more important in the voting. And it's like everything else in life. It changes, and not always in ways you like.
And it ends up for selecting different CEOs and all kinds of things. I mean, you're not going to appoint a successor CEO that's going to come in and said everything that's been done before is, it's been kind of fraudulent. I mean, if we needed to book an extra sale after the end of the quarter, if we needed to adjust the reserves, and it's once you start lying, it's all over. And I just don't know any way around that except to try every way you can to not. You sure can't. If you set the wrong example at the top, you got a real problem. We've never told anybody to change a figure. We never will. And if they had been changing figures, we'd be in all kinds of trouble because they know it and I know it and the next person would know it, and it just deteriorates. And we've really seen it. We've really seen it time after time. The way boards operate, it has to be process oriented. I mean, I understand the problems that Delaware has in writing a statute that judges face when they look at things, but it's extraordinary. It's just extraordinary what an emphasis on process can do to an organization because they think they can do anything if it's allowed, and eventually the foundation crumbles. Okay. Oh, I should make a little news here. So uh, uh, you've all come, and you may or may not see this, but it's very possible. One of the things I bought, was bought for a different purpose by a different manager months earlier. He bought roughly 15 million shares of Activision, and I never paid. I knew about the company, but I would just see it at the monthly report. But then on January, I don't know, 17th or 18th, something like that, Microsoft announced they were going to buy Activision for $95 a share. Now, when they announced that, at that point, Activision becomes a different kind of security. It becomes what Charlie and I used to call, well, everybody did, 50 years ago, we call them workouts or something like that, and they become known as arbitrage. Well, they're not really arbitrage, but they're securities, they're, in this case, a common stock, whose value depends not on what the market price does, but whether a given corporate event occurs, an announced corporate event occurs. Well, Microsoft wants to buy Activision, we'll say. Well, they said at $95 a share. And they've got the money. And obviously, mergers and big mergers, tech companies, all kinds of things, have got all kinds of problems with the world generally in terms of opinion. So you don't know what the Justice Department will do, or you don't know what the EU will do, and all kinds of things. But at that point, it becomes a different security. And Charlie and I, 50 years ago, we used to do a lot of that sort of thing. And Gus Levy did it at Goldman Sachs, and we even went back one time, I think, on British Columbia Power, didn't we, Charlie?
Yeah, we certainly did.
Yeah, a guy named Bennett was up there, and we were trying to figure out whether some takeover of the power business. I mean, we spent a lot of time analyzing the probabilities of announced deals going through, and we call them workouts. Now the term became ARB, and it hasn't worked overall too well in recent years. Now, every now and then, I see something that I want to do in that field, but very seldom, because they got to be big. The profit is limited. You know, if they say you're going to get 95, you're not going to get 96, and if the deal blows up, you may have a stock that's at 40 or something. So but we did it with Monsanto 5 or 6 years ago when Bayer was buying it, and we got very lucky because it turned out to be a terrible acquisition for Bayer, but it did go through because Bayer had the money, and they went through with the deal, even though Monsanto came with a problem that nobody really understands the extent of. And we did it with Red Hat when IBM bought it. So in any event, on January, whatever it was, 17th, 18th, 19th, Microsoft announces it. And the stock, which had been at 60, let's see I may have a slide here, which I'll find. But in any event, the stock, which had been in the 60s, went up to the 81 or 2. And that looked like not a big enough spread to me for a few days. And then it settled back a little. So anyway, we now own 9.5%, something like 9.5% of Activision. And if we went over 10%, we would file a report. So in order that the news people don't feel that there's no news there, I can tell you that as of yesterday, we own about 9.5%. If we go past 10%, there'll be a form filed with the SEC and so on. But it is my purchases, not the manager who bought it some months ago. If the deal goes through, we make some money, and if the deal doesn't go through, who knows what happens. But I just want to be sure that if we do file that report, people understand very clearly, because there's been some very mixed up stories on that in the past. We want to be very clear that it was Warren Buffett's decision in that particular case, and he doesn't know what the Justice Department's going to do. He doesn't know what the EU is going to do. He's never talked to anybody in Microsoft about it or anything. He's just read a document. He's made his own assessment, and it can change. And at one time, I think we sold a few shares even when I thought it was a little higher than it should be. And turned out those sales were not bad sales. And so I just want to create a little news for you, and I want to, if possible, head off stories which have been incorrect in the past, and which then get picked up by other media, and corrections never get written. That all the corrections were written by one inaccurate story, and they apologized even to me. Both the reporter and the editor sent me a personal note of apology, and they didn't expect to make a mistake, but when the other publications picked up the story, they didn't bother to pick up the correction, and millions of people were misinformed, and probably literally by the time it gets spread around. This one I will attempt to head off by telling you exactly what the facts are right now, and we'll see whether we go beyond 10%. But if, it could easily be that if it went up a few dollars, it's still a $95 deal. It's still, we don't know what the Justice Department will do. We don't know what the EU will do. We don't know what 30 other jurisdictions will do. One thing we do know is Microsoft has the money, so that takes that one risk out of it. So anyway, Charlie, do you have any news to break?
No.
Yeah, and incidentally, I don't talk this over with Charlie. I mean, he knows what occasionally I'll see an arbitrage deal and do it, and 50 years ago we were doing it together, and his general feeling is, why is Warren fooling around with this kind of stuff even? But it's the old fire horse, but occasionally it looks like the odds are in our favor. But absolutely, we could lose money on that company, and fairly large sums of money, depending on what happened if the deal blows up. And there will be a lot of people that want the deal to blow up. But Microsoft doesn't want it to blow up, so we'll have to see what happens. Okay, enough. Becky.
Charlie just mentioned index funds in passing, so let's go to this question from Matt Feigl. His question is related to the growth of passive investing through index funds and ETFs. He says, passive investment vehicles now control upwards of 50% of the United States stock market. The actual owners of these passive investment vehicles decided passive investing makes the most sense for them. Yet in doing so, passive investors have empowered the large index funds to become the biggest activists in the market. These passive managers now enjoy enormous, and I would argue undue, influence over corporate governance. Do Warren or Charlie see any benefit or logic to a rule that would prohibit passive investment vehicle managers from voting the shares they control for their passive investment clients?
Well, I'll take that. I think the guy's right. I think the thing's out of control and counterproductive. And I don't think it's good for the country to have 3 passive investors with bright young men from Harvard or what else telling them what proper governance of corporations is. It's not a good development. And I think indexing, if it gets to 90%, then it won't work very well at all. But at the moment, it's worked fine.
Yeah, well, the one thing you can count on, too, is that if it does look like it's going to, if the public opinion shifts over to the idea that it really is a good idea to let 3 people decide the fate of every company in corporate America, the 3 people, and they won't collaborate or do anything. They're evil people at the least. I mean, they're just doing what you and I would do. They would figure we don't care that much about voting. What we do care about is keeping a lot of assets under management. So we'll figure out something that ends up reflecting public opinion, and then politicians won't get mad at us. And our only threat really is that politicians get mad at us and regulate us in some way. So we'll head it off. And I would predict fairly confidently that if the American public doesn't like the idea of three people controlling things, the three people and their organizations and everything, but what they want to do is they want to get bigger. And they wouldn't be where they are in life if they hadn't wanted to get bigger. Those things don't happen by accident. That doesn't mean it's the only thing they want. They want their investors to get good results and everything. But they are certainly not going to follow a policy which is going to cause a backlash that causes them to be a lot smaller then. They can figure out their self-interest. I mean, and it just so happens that in this case, it would achieve the right result, which is that they would not control America, but they'll do what's good for themselves and what they have to do, what's politically acceptable. The only thing that really can mess up what is a very good deal for them is to have Congress change the rules. And the rules were the Investment Company Act of 1940 really changed how people behaved, and it's governed things in a big way for a very long time. And anybody that takes on the federal government loses. And if you're talking about trying to do that sort of thing, and they don't need to do it. They just say, well, we'll give up voting, or we'll vote our shares as the rest of people do. And of course, if you vote your shares as the rest of the people do, then if the index funds had 90% of the country, you could take over a company by somebody else buying 3 or 4% because you'd automatically get the funds to follow your very small little percentage. You'll see it all play out. I mean, it's a big case, but it's not an unusual case. Okay, station 7.
Yeah, Eric Erda, and I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So I want to first say thank you so much for a lifetime of knowledge you have both graciously shared with all of us. You've contributed greatly to push our species forward. Moreover, you've taught all of us here, along with many, many millions not here, how to behave more rationally, treat one another with more love, and lead more fulfilling lives. And for that, I want to say a very sincere thank you.
Thank you.
As for my question, I want to ask about Berkshire Hathaway Energy and the unique structure that has evolved there, given that Berkshire doesn't own 100% of the company. The first part of that question is related to Greg's ownership and his corresponding incentive alignment with overall Berkshire. Now, there's a wise man named Charlie that in 1995, at a speech to Harvard, taught us how important incentives are to human behavior. I would conservatively say that Greg's stake in BHE is worth more than $500 million at present. And I'm curious if you can share any plans that you have to convert his Berkshire Hathaway energy ownership to Berkshire stock. And if there isn't a plan to do this, can you please explain why we shouldn't be concerned about Greg's incentive structure going forward? The second part is about leverage at the entity. You have always said that BHE operates with an appropriate amount of leverage given its earning power. With that said, it's still a very, very large debt figure in relation to current earnings, especially with what we have become accustomed to at Berkshire, And I'm curious, if Berkshire owned 100% of Berkshire Hathaway Energy, would you still operate the business with the same amount of leverage?
Okay, thank you. The second part is the easiest one to answer, so I'll take that. And I'll throw the first one back to Charlie. But the Berkshire Hathaway Energy actually is required with its regulated utilities, and it basically started pretty much with regulated utilities, and still is dominated by that. And we're interested in buying more regulated utilities. It's required in different ways by different states and by different regulatory authorities to have a large amount of debt, because the regulatory authorities will say in Iowa or to pick any state, the regulatory authorities are going to say you can get debt money cheaper than you can get equity money, which historically has largely been, almost always been true. And they say that since we're going to allow you a return on equity, we'll say, just pick a figure, but let's say they allow us a return on equity of 9%, and we can borrow a lot of capital at 3%, they say it'll result in higher rates to customers if you use it, put in all equity. We would love to have all equity in our utilities, but we wouldn't, the regulator wouldn't stand for it, because it would result in, under the traditional system, it would result in higher prices to consumers. So that's built into the system. And we would, well, our regulator wouldn't allow us essentially to get the same return on equity and have an all equity structure. And the answer is, we put, well, you actually saw in the film earlier, which the people that are listening or hearing the webcast didn't see, but just in Iowa, we recently got approval to spend $300 billion, but they want us. Iowa has a history, and like every other state in the union, except Nebraska, which is all public power, but every private powers, they have a history of wanting X percent to be in debt. They want you to raise a lot of money in debt because it's cheaper, means cheaper power for the consumer. So the answer is, if we owned 100% of Berkshire Energy, we would absolutely be following the same. We would be operating pursuant to what the utility commissions tell us they want us to do. That they represent the people of those states. Now, Charlie, do you want?
Well, the other one's simple too. It's a historical accident. It's not causing any big tension or breaches of fiduciary duty. We had the same problem with Walter Scott, who was the director for years and years, and owned stock in the same company, also an historical accident. I just don't think it's a big problem at all. I see no behavior from Greg ever that isn't in the best interest of Berkshire.
Yeah, and we've had various percentages of Berkshire Hathaway Energy ever since we bought it in around 2000. And it happened, we were at my sister who's here, we were at her house, and there was a party going on, and 20 or 30, probably 30 people. And Walter said to me, if you got a minute or two, I'd like to talk to you about something. So we went in the library or someplace, and Walter says, we've got this company and it doesn't seem to fit the public mold very well. And would you want to buy in and go private? And I said, sure. Depends on the price. And when we got back to Omaha, I was out on the West Coast. We got back to Omaha. We met with David Sokol, who was the big holder, aside from Walter. And we agreed on a price. I remember Walter saying to Dave, "Don't negotiate with Warren. he'll tell you to forget it and he'll do something else." And so we bought it, and so it was kind of a weird structure from the start, and we had a public utility holding company act to deal with and all kinds of things, and it's evolved, and it now has us with 91% roughly, and it has Walter's estate, and I don't know where that goes, and at all. And Walter never talked to me about it, and I never asked him about it. But it's one way or another interest connected with him, and the estate now, or close to 8, I guess. And Greg's got 1, and the from our standpoint, if we made a deal with if they ever came to us and the Scott interest wanted to do something, we'd say fine with him. We'll do the same thing with Greg if he wants to, and he probably would want to. I mean, but from our standpoint, I've never seen any decision remotely. If I thought that would make a difference, he would not be. He just wouldn't be the right kind of person to run Berkshire. And the problem, of course, is that you've got lots of process that can be involved with insiders and everything, and I've got no interest in. As long as I'm alive, my interests are 100% with Berkshire, and the board wouldn't probably, and to some extent, a little reluctantly, but they just say, "Well, Warren thinks the deal's okay, it must be okay," which is true. And so I could make a deal with anybody, and it doesn't get all messed up with process. But on the other hand, if I'm not around, the pressures are to directors to do whatever the lawyers tell them to do, and the lawyers tell them to do this and that, and then they want to bring in investment bankers to make a value. And the whole thing is a game from that point forward. And it's expensive. It takes a lot of time. The people, so it would be better if it happened while I'm alive and around. But there's no reason. We'd rather have 100% than 91%, obviously, because more earnings for Berkshire. But there's no reason to try and do anything with either the Scott interests or Greg, unless they want to do it. And the logical thing is if anything happened with the Scotts, we'd certainly offer it to Greg. But who knows what happens in the future? The one thing I guarantee you, Berkshire Hathaway holders will never be taken advantage of, and you can sue my estate or something like that if anybody felt differently about that. It isn't going to happen. But it's a lot easier if it's done while I'm around, actually, than if it's done later. But
I wish we had 20 more conflicts of interest just like it.
Yeah, that's exactly true. Yeah, it's a perfectly logical question. I mean, but it is not a problem, and any answer that's arrived at will be good for all concerned. And right now, I've got no feeling that well, I have no knowledge at all of where the stock that the Scots have goes, or how they feel about it, or anything, and that's up to them. The Walter was our partner, and as far as we're concerned, we treat anybody connected with them as our partner, and they know that. They don't have to worry about us taking advantage of them, and we can understand if they don't do anything. We can understand that. If they want to do something, we can understand that. It's a good question, though. Thank you. Okay, Becky.
This question comes from Steve Blackmore in Bozeman, Montana. This is to Charlie. He says, in the past, you've made favorable statements about investing in China, in part based upon valuation metrics. What is your opinion now, and how much weight do you put on the actions of the government in your analysis? Do the recent Communist Party activities in China, including human rights violations, blatant cyber theft from U.S. companies and others, crackdowns on speech from business and media, et cetera, cause you to change your opinion on investing in China? And how do you evaluate the clear dangers of investing under authoritarian regimes, as recently evidenced by Russian atrocities in Ukraine?
Well, those are good questions, and there's no question about the fact that the government of China has worried the investors from the United States who invest in China more in recent months and years than he did in earlier periods. So there's been some tension, and it's affected the prices of some of the Chinese stocks, particularly internet stocks. Just in the last day or two, the Chinese leader has sort of reversed course on that and said he went too far and he's going to pull way back and so on and so on. So we're having some hopeful signs. But yes, there are more difficulties of dealing with the regime in China than there are in the United States. And it's different. It's a long way away, and they have their own culture and their own loyalties and so on and so on. And the reason that I invested in China is I could get so much better companies at so much lower prices, and I was willing to take a little political risk to get into the better companies at the lower prices. Other people might reach the opposite conclusion, and everybody is more worried about China now than they were 2 or 3 years ago. So that's just the way it is.
I have nothing to add. Okay. Station 8.
Hi, Warren and Charlie. My name is Tom Ringe. I'm from Wayne, Pennsylvania. It's great to be back here after 2 years. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
In this year's letter, you talked about insurance float, the evolution of float, the per share float, the effect on repurchase to increase the per share float. And in regard to the repurchase, I would say thank you as your partner for your careful repurchase as well as careful issuance of our shares. My question is about your expectation for the likelihood that float will be stable and the cost will be zero or close to that over time with adverse years from time to time. What about Berkshire's insurance businesses give you the confidence to make that statement when your competitors are trying to do the same thing, but haven't been able to come close to achieving Berkshire's record in cost and growth of float? Thank you.
Yeah, well, they really aren't trying to do the same thing, which is kind of interesting. The answer to your question is we wouldn't be in the business unless it was my judgment that the likelihood, the weighted probabilities are higher that the flow will be useful to us rather than costly to us. And nobody will know the answer to that for a very long time. So far, so good. But it is a judgment, and absolutely I could be wrong about it. But you know, I think both Charlie and I would say that we think the odds are that it's a winning bet, and the odds are pretty good, and that we're quite well positioned to do it if anybody does it. But did we know 9/11 was coming, or I mean, it is not a sure thing.
Just think of what the potential is, though, when you're reviewing it. If we could buy common stocks we were virtually sure would give us 8% after taxes with our whole float, that would be a hell of a lot of money. And
Well,
how
it'd be
many
11
people-
billion. I can tell you what it'd be.
And-
11 or 12 billion
Yes, it's an enormous amount of money.
annually.
Yes, and the float has been growing. So relax. We're glad to have the float.
But Charlie stuck in a couple of ifs there. If we could earn it, and if we could, the answer is, that it's our job, and we think we can do it as well as anybody, or we wouldn't be doing it. But it's our job to figure out what businesses we want to be in, and when they don't make sense, reluctantly, occasionally, to give up on them, like the textile business. But those are the hard decisions, and insurance. Didn't have the faintest idea back in 1967 when Jack Ringwald stopped by the office at stopped by at about 11:45, and Charlie Hyder set him up. And Jack, about once a year, he'd get mad at the regulators. He just didn't like being regulated. And he'd say to himself, I'm going to sell this damn thing. And Charlie caught him one day, and he said, Jack is in the heat. I said, bring him around. So he came up, and 11:45, and Jack said he wanted to get rid of this damn business. The regulators were driving him nuts or something. And I said, fine, I'll buy it. And I said, what price do you want? And he said, I think $50 a share then. I said, fine, we've done it. We don't need an audit. We don't need anything. And then Jack started, and he said, immediately, he really changed his mind, but he was too honorable to back out. So he said, well, I suppose you'll want me to sell you the agencies. And I said, no. And of course, if I'd said yes, and then he said, well, then we can't do it. So I just said, no, yeah, you keep them, Jack. And he said, I suppose you'll want me to do this. I said, no, I won't want you to do that. He was hoping I would just give him an out. But after doing that for 15 or 20 minutes, he saw that I was going to agree to everything he said, and he said he'd sell it to me at 50. So he followed through, and that was that. And it was pure luck. And
But
Jack,
Gordon, we really like our float, don't we?
pardon me?
We really like our float.
Oh yeah, no,
We love it.
No, we made the most of it, but we didn't make the most of it till Ajit came along, and who knew that the guy was going to walk into my office in 1986, and I would decide that he was the guy to make this damn thing work that I hadn't been able to make work the way I wanted it to, and who knew that Geico would come along later, and who knew it. There's just all kinds of things. The one thing you have to do is be prepared. When opportunity comes, you really do have to just move. And fortunately, I operate in an environment, and I wouldn't operate in any other environment. I get out of there, but I operate in an environment where I can do it. And it'd be crazy of the board to say, we want to set up a committee to review every acquisition and all that. And I would say that's fine, but you can work with somebody else, because I just don't like to go through all that stuff. I've got other things to do the rest of my life. There's so much luck, but there is that you do have to be mentally prepared and to do something when it makes sense, and do it big time and do it instantly. And then you got to be sure you've got the resources to do it.
The relative absence of bureaucracy at Berkshire
Unbelievable.
has made the company a lot of extra money for a very, very long time.
And it's made my life happier.
And yes, but that's ideal.
But in the end, we are extraordinarily well positioned to do exactly what we want to do with float, while at the same time never putting ourselves in the position, never coming close to making a promise we can't keep. We had two small insurance subsidiaries well before Ajit. Two companies I bought. One I really didn't know that much about. The other one, I did it all by myself. And they were disasters. And left alone, which they could have been, they'd have gone bankrupt. And we just didn't want to do it. So, we could pay the liabilities, and if the parent company got involved, or we put it in another insurance company or something, and we did it. I mean, it's Berkshire. In a crazy way, I look at Berkshire as a painting, and it's unlimited in size. It's got an ever-expanding canvas, and I get to paint what I want. And if somebody wants to paint something else, then I'll go someplace and I'll get a smaller little thing and I'll paint away. And I actually, I'm no good. I don't know anything about paintings. Take me to an art museum, and all I really want to know is where the men's room is. But I'm just not interested. And other people look at paintings, and they see something, and then they see something additionally later on. And I mean, they really have a different sort of perception ability in relation to that. And to me, Berkshire's a painting, and I get to paint. And the object, obviously, I want my partners to come out well in it, but the real thing I like is the painting. And as long as it's in my head, and I see different things in it as I go along, and it's the closest thing I can come to enjoying myself every minute of the day. and it's not, I don't prescribe it for other people. And occasionally not so occasionally, but I see things in the painting, I think, well, I should have done that differently, and I go back and paint it over, and it's satisfying. And who knows why human beings react in that manner, but I do know what makes me happy and what doesn't make me happy. I found what makes me happy, so why in the world would I change it? So that's a short answer to a question that I can't remember what it was. Okay. Becky.
This question comes from Andrew Kiesau from Minneapolis, Minnesota. He says, last year, Warren mentioned that inflation had noticeably impacted the prices that Berkshire's businesses were paying and charging. Given those inflationary trends have continued and in some cases accelerated since last year's meeting, could you comment on how this particular inflationary period ranks among previous such periods in the United States, like the 1970s and 1980s? And what can American businesses and citizens do to reduce the negative impacts that inflation brings about?
Well, we've sort of attacked what you do yourself. And you develop skills that people are willing to pay for in the future, regardless of what the unit of exchange is. But in terms of inflation in our own businesses, it's extraordinary how much we've seen. I think you interviewed Herb Lumpkin at the Furniture Mart, and for 2 years, the prices have just kept coming in higher for these things, and we sell them for higher prices, and people have more money than they've had before, and they like to buy. And there's certain things they can't buy. It's like during World War II, you had a lot of money created, and people couldn't buy cars, and they couldn't buy refrigerators, and they couldn't even buy as much sugar or coffee or things as they wanted. They had little stamps and gasoline and all kinds of things. Well, eventually, if you get a lot of money in people's hands and you don't have very many goods, prices go up. Now, you can do all kinds of things to try and talk it down. And of course, inflation is never the same. Nothing in economics is the same the second time after it happens than the first, because the first affects people's attitudes in the second, and their attitudes always influence the activity itself. I mean, it is an interesting phenomenon. people write a textbook and they write it based on the last experience, and people read the textbook so they behave differently next time, and then they wonder why they're getting a different result than they got the time before. So anyway, we have sent out lots and lots and lots. When I say we, I mean the United States government. The government has sent out lots of money to people. And at some point, the money can't be worth as much as it was when there was less money out. Here's an interesting figure that I think probably will astound you. Sounds me anyway. The Federal Reserve every Thursday puts out a balance sheet. The Federal Reserve and Treasury, they're complicated institutions, but they do put out this kind of consolidated statement of all the various Federal Reserve banks, all these things that have entered into legislation over the years, but there's a balance sheet. And 15 years ago, roughly, if you look, the Federal Reserve issues those notes I talked about a while back, and that's the one, there's the current one, and they print these pieces of paper. And they, one way or another, they got it in the hands of people. Well, the interesting thing is people said cash is dead and all that sort of thing, cashless society. Well, there were 800 billion, go back 10 or 15 years, but there was about 800 billion of currency in circulation. And if you look at last Thursday's report, you'll see there's something like now $2.2 trillion of currency in circulation, 2.2 trillion. Now there's about, there's 330 million people in the United States. Let's look at it that way. And with 330 million people, and you have almost 2.3 trillion of currency in circulation, that's $7,000 per person. Every man, woman, and child, in theory, has $7,000 worth of currency. Well, that isn't right, but you do know that the Federal Reserve's bookkeeping is essentially right. They've got that much that's out there. I don't know where it is. I mean, I don't know whether it's in Russia. I don't know whether it's in South America. I don't know where, I don't know whether Charlie's got it all. I mean, it's a staggering sum. Cash is dead, and yet we, on average, have $7,000 for every person in the United States. Now, while you're absorbing that, think for a moment what would happen if the U.S. government said, well, they work it out in private, and they decide that they're going to send Federal Reserve, and I'm not going to blame the Federal Reserve for this. Somebody back in Washington decides that they're going to send out $1 million to every household in the United States. And there are 130 million households in the United States or something like that, and they're going to mail you $1 million in cash. And there were a couple of provisions attached to it. One is, if you talked about it in the next 30 days, the money disappeared. So it was like in one of those old TV shows or something, and poof, disappears. And after 30 days, you could spend it. Well, all of a sudden, the household wealth of the United States, Federal Reserve puts out an estimate, was 130 trillion or something like that. So basically, you've doubled the household wealth. And all you've done is mailed out people, but you don't tell them you're doing it with everybody. You just say they won the lottery or whatever it may be. And now you've got an amount equal to household wealth. On average, people have doubled it. They've got this extra 100 30 trillion of wealth, and in a month they can spend it. Well, what's going to happen? Well, prices are going to go up, but are they going to go up immediately? Well, you don't know the other guy got it. You just know you've got it. So you don't really feel like you got to rush out and buy things. But as soon as word gets around, well, we've mailed out. If you look at the amount we've distributed, the federal government, I'm just talking about the distribution of resources. We're talking numbers like that, and it affects prices. It has to affect prices. You had 10 times as much. If you went home and you found out you had 10 times the net worth you had yesterday, but everybody else did the same thing. It doesn't increase the amount of bread in the economy or the number of cars. It just means that the price, the value of this is going to go down, and its purchasing power, you can't buy more than exists. So it's a very strange period where we had lots of money sent out to people. One way or another, we're getting it, that they didn't find as many things to buy as before, and we had supply chain disruption. We have all these things happen. But the end of it is they go out to the Nebraska Furniture Mart and they start buying things. And they do it with our other companies. And they do it in very peculiar ways. And now they're buying, one thing, jewelry stores were, generally speaking, not a very good business. And 2 years ago, every landlord that had a jewelry store or multiple jewelry stores in their mall, was wondering how they were going to get their rent. And now every jewelry store virtually is doing incredibly better than they ever dreamt, with way less inventory, because people are just come in and buy. And they don't wait for sales. When they walk in the store, they're going to walk out and they're going to have bought something, and they pay for it. They got the money. So we are seeing an unleashing of the fact that we've just mailed a lot of money to people, one way or another. It's very indirect. It all gets complicated when we talk about a big system, but this is what's happened. And I will guarantee you that if we mail out $1 million to every household in the United States tonight, and you don't know that it's happened, you don't really expect much to happen in behavior tomorrow, but somehow at some point, and then if you start doing it every month, we'll say, and people really know you're doing it, then they start anticipating it and buying at a time and forward. There's a million things that happen in economics, but the answer is we've had a lot of inflation, and it was almost impossible not to have if you're going to mail out the kind of money we've mailed out. And it's probably a good thing we did it. In fact, I think there was one point when the Federal Reserve, which in effect creates the money, if they hadn't done it, your lives would be a lot worse, a whole lot worse now. And that was an important decision. And that's the way that's why you've had inflation, and heaven knows, it could end. You can throw the country into recession. You can do all kinds of things. The country's going to have recessions, incidentally, and it's going to have depressions periodically. And things will happen differently. And you'll read a newspaper today and you'll wonder a year from now, why was I reading the newspaper a year ago? It's just the way it works. When I bought the first stock in 1942, did I know everything was going to happen afterwards? Of course not. I didn't know a damn thing. But I just needed to have one idea, and that idea wasn't really well formed. It was just probably the way practically every kid felt about the country when we just gone into a war. We thought America was going to win, and America was going to win then. It was going to win just generally, and savings bonds were paying 2.9%. I learned that because we bought them. They called them war bonds originally, and they called them defense bonds, and they called them savings bonds, but they were the same thing. And it's you print loads of money, and money is going to be worth less. Not worthless. I got in trouble doing that one time with CNBC because I said it was going to be worth separately less, but got contracted down to worthless. So it took me a few years to learn to separate those words somehow. Anyway, that's everything I know about economics and more, and Charlie can probably improve on it.
Well, it happened on a scale this time we'd never seen before. Those checks that were just mailed out to everybody who claimed to have a business and claimed to have employees, they probably drowned the country in money for a while. And as you say, they probably had to do it. But it was something that had never been done on that scale before.
But we had a problem we hadn't had before.
Yes. No, I'm not saying it wasn't a good idea.
I mean, in my book, Jay Powell's a hero. I mean, it's very, very simple. I mean, he did what he had to do. You know, when if he had done nothing, it would be he would be, be very easy to engage in what you would call thumb sucking then. And I shouldn't say plenty of, but there are other Fed chairmen that would have been sucking their thumbs, and the world would have fallen around them. And nobody would have exactly blamed them. They would have blamed the virus and the Chinese and all kinds of things.
Well, the really interesting company is Japan, where they buy back all the debt, and then they start buying back all the common stocks. Now that's really weird. And what did they get? 25 years of stasis. Who would have predicted that?
Well, nobody predicted anything. I mean, there's nobody's predictions that we're interested in, including our own. I mean, it's very simple. What we do know is that we can deserve your trust, and there's no reason to do things that don't deserve it, and we can't tell what. But basically, we think we're trying to build a Berkshire that can't withstand a nuclear exchange, but it can withstand as much as anything that we can do anything about. And that leaves us feeling good. It doesn't leave us feeling perfect. We'd like to even promise you more than that, but we can't promise more than that. So it's very simple. And with that, we'll move on to 18. Let's see, that's station 9.
Dear Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger, I'm Ili Abushakra from Montreal, Canada. I would like to thank you for everything you've done for us, your fellow shareholder. My question is regarding the GAP rules. If you were to change it, what would you change and what it would look like? Thank you.
Well, I would resign the job. What would you do, Charlie? No, it's an impossible problem because, first of all, you have to decide what gap is supposed to reflect, and it doesn't reflect value. But in certain cases, of course, it is important to say that this is value and so on. I mean, it's a convention, and it is done so that the auditor generally is protected, because otherwise everybody sues everybody in this country for anything. And it's designed to cause people who want to report a given amount of whatever is desired by the market to largely be able to do it. I don't know how I would write the rules. I mean, I've watched people who I would be delighted to have live next to me. You know, if I was going away for 2 weeks and my kids were to stay at somebody's house, it'd be fine with me if they stayed there. If I lost my wallet someplace and they found it, they'd return it to me. But they'd play games with any number that came to them. And of course, it's it's a very awkward thing to be on the audit committee of a company where people are playing around with the numbers, and they don't want you. If you raise a stink, you've got all kinds of problems. And I actually wrote something some years ago of four. I was kind of anticipating your question about 15 years ago, I guess, and I wrote 4 suggestions for questions to be asked of the audit committee. And I don't know whether I was on the audit committee then of Coke or where, but anyway, it was just clear to me what was happening. But you really had to follow the charade, or you got in all kinds of trouble for doing that too. And so I just put 4 questions out that I would want to know, and they were perfectly logical questions. And in the end, nobody adopted them. I mean, the system was fine as it was. The auditors got sued, but not that often. And the SEC had lots of rules, and I admired the SEC enormously. I think the country is better off because of the SEC, but it is a hopeless question or problem to devise rules that people can't get around. I mean, it's not. I think it was, who was it that my friend that was a writer said, it's not the illegal things that are outrageous, it's the legal things. It's very hard. You try and it's worthwhile. You need an SEC, but the SEC can't really stop the stuff that you would find outrageous. Explain. And the auditors have the same question. I mean, the auditors really want rules, and they want processes, and they want it to be so they can operate. Charlie he was on the audit committee of Solomon, and we had probably literally millions of contracts where people put numbers in. And he found that $20 million, we had the largest auditing firm in the country then, Arthur Andersen, as I remember.
They're gone now.
Yeah, they're gone now, but they were the largest. And Charlie found a $20 million error, I think, one time in an audit.
They called it a plug. When your accountant starts talking about a plug, it's not good.
Well, I'll tell you a story I haven't told before. You saw in that movie, people who were here saw me testify in August before a subcommittee who were out to, get their way, and I just decided I was just going to answer every question honestly, and I was not going to try and draw up anything. So I just sat in front of them and said what I knew and didn't know. And one of the things I said, which was absolutely true, is that I'd only been there 10 days or so at Solomon, but I said I really haven't seen anything yet that strikes me as terrible in accounting. But I've been there 10 days. But this guy who got us in all this trouble, so far, he's the only thing I found. I don't know what else was going to be found. How in the hell could I know what had gone in a place that was doing, incredible numbers of transactions and everything? Well, but I said, what I've seen, the accounting strikes me as legit. About a month later, I was so happy I testified earlier, not later. A very fine CFO, and these are decent people. They're very decent people. And he comes in and he said, Warren, there's probably something you should know. And I said, well, what's that? And he said, well, 12 years earlier, or whatever it was, Solomon had merged with Fibro, which was a huge trading company. Solomon was a huge investment banking company. It became this huge powerhouse. And he said, 12 years ago when we merged with him, we sort of couldn't find exactly they were on a trade basis and we were on a settlement basis. And they said, we've never really figured out how to put the books together. This is the largest audit company in the United States, Arthur Andersen, that's responsible for signing this thing. So we have this number, and every day it moves around, and it's just put in there to make assets equal liabilities. and today it's 173,412,000, down to a penny, and tomorrow it'll be something different. And I thought to myself, I am sure glad I testified before Congress a month ago, because I did not know then. But if they ever ask me again, I'm gonna tell them exactly what happened. That we just got this number that floats around every day, and we haven't found it in 12 years. And Arthur Andersen doesn't know where it is. and you got to make the assets equal to the liabilities, right? I mean, so what else do you do? And that's exactly what happened. And strange things happen in this world. There's one thing.
The name was the floating plug.
Yeah. And Charlie's on the audit committee. Yeah. Yeah, the one thing I've always suggested, nobody ever wants to do this. And I can understand why. But you've got trillions of dollars worth of contracts and everything that people are putting down little numbers for every day at banks and investment banks and all over the world. I mean, commodity traders. And at Berkshire, we stick down something. There's certain hedging that even the regulators want us to do in terms of giving utilities, and we put a little number in. And I've made the suggestion once or twice that if you really want to do something sort of interesting, give them a couple of weeks and pick the 100 most kind of complicated, long-term, lots of wording, derivative contracts, and look at what one side who promises to do something values it at, and look at what the other side who also reports, and just let them do it for 100 operations at random. I just like to know if somebody's valuing we're valuing a contract at 28 million, the other guy's valuing it at 33 million, and you've got the same auditing firm in both cases, and they're signing their name to them. I don't think anybody's ever done anything with that suggestion. and it's, that would be the first thing I would do, actually, if I really wanted to sort of dig into what was happening in accounting. But there's a lot of things in life you can't change, and nobody is going to go looking for ways to create lawsuits and newspaper stories, all kinds of things, and I don't blame them. So I brought one thing I just couldn't resist. I was hoping I'd get a question, so I'll ask it myself. I was hoping to get a question that, how could some guy be so idiotic as to propose a price of $848.02 or whatever it was, or is, for Allegheny Court. And I mean, isn't that getting a little scientific? And of course, I did provide, when I made the offer, that it'd be $850 less whatever was paid to whatever investment banker they wanted to select, Allegheny in this case. And they're bound to have to do it because Delaware law is developed in such a way that the directors are protected if they get expert opinions, all that sort of thing. So I don't fault anybody in the system, but I just thought it might be useful, actually, maybe to Delaware judges someday, Delaware statute makers, maybe people that are writing papers, who knows? But I suggested that we just, since I'm willing to pay $850 a share for the place as is, if the audit fees are, if the advisory fees are 10 million or 40 million, that it makes a difference to someone. And it's always made a difference to us as the buyer, but that's just the way the game was. Well, there's a little history to that. And I went back, and there's been twice nobody's ever paid attention to this, but there's been twice in the history of Berkshire Hathaway, 57 years, twice that Berkshire was required to get a fairness opinion. And it was perfectly logical that we be required to get a fairness opinion in those two cases, because in one case, Diversified Retailing, which was a company I was invested in both of them that came out of our partnership, but one had a group of shareholders that were different than the other group of shareholders at Berkshire, and the two want to merge. So you have two companies with me being the biggest beneficiary in between. And it wasn't up to me to determine the ratio. I mean, even though I had the most involved, but I had a little more of one company than the other. So anyway, a fairness opinion was required. And this has only been twice in the history of Berkshire that one was required. So naturally, I went to Charlie. I said, Charlie, we do have to, Charlie told me, he knew it better than I did. We need a fairness opinion in this case. And I said, I know what's fair. You know what's fair. Sandy knows what he thinks is fair. If the three of us owned it, in 10 minutes, we could have worked out a deal that all three of us regarded as fair. But because there were public shareholders and everything, it wasn't right to do it that way. And the first one, we have two of these, but the first one was November 27th, 1978. And I told the shareholders, essentially, that my personal belief is that both Diversified and Berkshire shareholders will benefit from the merger, but I will vote for the merger only if a majority of the shares which are voted by other shareholders of each company are voted to support it. So, which was fine. I committed myself, that let the other people decide whether this is fair. But on top of that, we needed to get a fairness opinion from an investment bank with a big name and everything. And so I said to Charlie, I said, these things are going for $1 million or $2 million, where they get some guy that they hired last week, and he writes up a little thing, and then we get a bill for $1 million or $2 million. They really haven't done anything. They don't know either company, and there's a million things they're not going to know about it, but they're going to write an opinion, and we need the opinion. I said, so what do I do? I go to Charlie with these kind of problems. And Charlie said, Warren, it's very simple. He said, pick out 10 prestigious investment banks and do exactly what I say. So, okay, Charlie, what do I do when I call and get these 10? He says, well, put them in order, 1 through 10. And he said, call the guy at the top of the list and tell him you'll pay him $60,000 for doing a fairness opinion. And you know that it's an insulting price, and it's ridiculous for him to do it because it'll affect what he can get from other people down the line. They'll look back and they'll say, well, Buffett only paid $60,000. Why should I pay $2 million? And but he said, just tell him that's what you'll pay. And if they're insulted by it, which they probably should be, and then you'll go to number 2. And they'll offer them the same deal. And you'll just keep going down until you get to number 10. And if you don't have anybody by number 10, you've told the other people, you'll come back to number 1 again. And you'll say, well, I'll pay $80,000. And then you'll go down the list and everything. Well, so I picked 10 names out. And number 1 name was Jack Shadd. And Jack Shadd was a friend of Tom Murphy's, a friend of Bill Ruane's, and he was running E.F. Hutton, and he was a very, very, very successful investment banker. I didn't know him as well as the others, but I'd met him through my friends. So I called up and I said, Jack, I said, I've got this crazy request. He says, only because everybody admires you so much, and my friends are your friends, and blah, blah, blah. And E.F. Hutton is so well regarded. I said, I'm going to do something I'm going to ask you something that is totally against your interest. And I fully understand the fact that you're going to say, you're an idiot to call me on this and slam down the phone. But I said, Jack, here's our procedure. And I described this procedure that he gets called first. And if he turns it down, then I go to Payne Weber, and then I go to and I go through it. And I tell him, there's these 10 people. And if we don't get any yeses, I'm going to come back to you again, and I'll offer you 75, and we'll do the same thing till somebody says yes. And I said, Jack, but you are the first call. So $60,000, and it's going to screw up your business if you do this, because every client you get in the future is going to say, well, you did it for diversified retailing and Berkshire. And why in the world should we pay you $2 million when he paid you $60,000? And Jack said, don't worry about it, Warren. I can take care of that. He says, we're in. And so we got a fairness opinion, but for one side. Now, the next call I made was to Payne Weber, and I gave him the same story. And I said, E.F. Hutton was dumb enough to take the one side for $60,000. I don't know why the hell they're doing it. They're destroying their reputation and all that. And Payne Weber said, we'll take the other side for $60,000. So we have a thing here that describes the whole process. And
they got well low. They sent out an amiable alcoholic they had to do something with.
Well, what they did was they each billed us for $60,000, and we paid it.
That's what you get for $60,000.
No. We got the same thing everybody else got, Charlie. And of course, Jack Shad, this was 1978. He was appointed chairman of the FCC for 7 years. I mean, Jack liked to do business, and it was true. It didn't hurt him. They paid us $60,000, and they went back and charged somebody else $2 million, the next week. And those guys, it's all play money. And so we did the same thing when we got the blue chip stamps, where we were similarly conflicted 4 or 5 years later. We went back to the same two guys, and there'd been a lot of inflation and everything like that. So we said 110,000 then. I've got the prospectus for that. And both of them said, send it in. Don't worry about our other clients. We'll figure out some story to tell them, and whatever it may be. But I just thought it would be interesting to, at some point, have people realize that it's not play money. Somebody pays it, and it's a game. And but it's what passes muster in Delaware, and the directors will have it explained to them by the lawyers that they're not going to get sued if they do it in a certain kind of way. And so I just decided that somebody at some point ought to point out what actually is happening in this situation, and that's why we did it that way. And it may go down with our earlier attempts to educate the world on the realities of finance and its various interactions, and why it's better to teach your son to be an investment banker than to be an electrician, or something. But you've got an eccentric chairman, and that's what he did. Charlie, how do you feel about this whole matter? It was your idea originally.
Well, we're a little peculiar. And it's not all the peculiarities are not bad.
I talked to Charlie before. And I didn't talk to Charlie before I did it this time. But Charlie has given me 4 ideas together that on extremely practical matters with so much. They just changed everything. I think you really ought to tell about the experience with the fraud claim.
What?
On the fraud claim, the fidelity claim with the guy, you had the very well-known insurance company that you don't have to name names, but where that, you basically told them just raise the stakes to make the game fair. This was back in the 1960s. Do you remember that?
I don't remember.
Oh, well, I do. I remember it.
Well, tell it then.
Charlie had this tiny little operation, which he ran his fund, also had a seat on the Pacific Coast Stock Exchange. The firm was called Wheeler Munger. It was called Wheeler Munger at first. Later, it changed itself to Munger Wheeler. And Jack Wheeler said, well, pretty soon it'll be Munger and Company, but that's okay. Jack Wheeler was a very interesting guy, and he had the specialist position in General Motors and a few things. And some employee stole, like, I don't know, $12,000 or something like that from the firm.
I remember. He hid the trading tickets.
Yeah, some guy steals some money, and Charlie's firm, Wheeler Munger, was required to have a fidelity bond and all these things that covered dishonest employees and all of that sort. So this guy's clearly dishonest. He's clearly stolen the money. So Charlie puts in a claim for $12,000 or something like that, whatever the loss was, and sends it to this very big and prestigious insurance company. And of course, the insurance company denies his claim. They say, the guy really wasn't employed, he doesn't exist, you don't have a dog, I mean, the whole thing. And Charlie gets this letter back, and they're not going to pay the claim. And so Charlie writes a letter to this very well-known, big-name person that runs the insurance company. And he said, he said, we have this $12,000 claim. And he said, this guy stole the money. And we thought we had an insurance policy against people stealing, paid us, people stole money. And he said, we're in this very interesting position because you've got a bunch of people on the payroll, and they're going to get their weekly check or monthly check, whatever they do. So they just say, we're not going to pay, and life goes on. Whereas I'm sitting here, and I've got my time. I got to work on this thing. And it isn't worth the $12,000 for me to fool around with this claim against the company, and they'll appeal it and all these things. So he said, I know that you would be offended by the thought that you might be using this inequality of bargaining position to avoid paying at the claim. I mean, that never could be your intention. So what I suggest, in order to really live up to your code of behavior, is why don't we make the $12,000 claim, we'll just multiply it by 10 and call it $120,000 either way. And if you lose, you pay me $120,000. If I lose, I'll pay you $120,000. Now it's worth my while. And he addresses the letter to the chairman and says that's the guy. He gets a $12,000 check by return mail. It's not a bad lesson. He's told me two others, but the tricks are too good. I don't even want to share them now. I may use them myself someday. Okay, let's go to Becky.
We got a lot of questions on this topic. I'll ask this one that came from Raj. He says, have you changed your views on Bitcoin and or cryptocurrency in any respect? I'm conflicted about this because his own views have slightly evolved during the past 2 years, from Bitcoin as a fraud and waste to Bitcoin is in a speculative bubble but might have some uses.
Well, I shouldn't answer any questions on the subject, but I will. There's all kinds of people watching this that are long Bitcoin, and there's nobody that's short, and nobody wants their windpipe stepped on. I don't blame them. I don't like people who step on my windpipe. But I would say this, that if the people in this room owned all of the farmland in the United States, and you offered me a 1% interest in it, and you said for a 1% interest in all the farmland in the United States, pay our group, well, let's see, 10 trillion, pay us this bargain price, $25 billion. I'll write you a check this afternoon, $25 billion. Now I own 1% of the farmland. If you tell me you own 1% of the apartment houses in the United States, and you offer me a 1% interest, so I'll have a 1% interest in all the apartment houses in the country, and you want whatever it may be for it, then call it another $25 billion or something. I'll write you a check. It's very simple. Now, if you told me you owned all of the Bitcoin in the world and you offered it to me for $25, I wouldn't take it, because what would I do with it? I have to sell it back to you one way or another. I mean, they have the same people, but it isn't going to do anything. The apartments are going to produce rental, and the farms are going to produce food. And if I've got all the Bitcoin, I'm back where whatever his name was, who may or may not have existed, was 15 years ago. If I've got it all, he could create a mystery about it. But everybody knows what I'm like. I mean, so if I'm trying to get rid of it, people will say, well, why should I buy some Bitcoin from you? I mean, why don't you call it Buffett coin? Make your own or something. What? Do something. But I'm not going to give you anything for it. And you'd be right, incidentally. But that explains the difference between productive assets and something that depends on the next guy paying you more than the last guy got. Now, net, if you look at it, a lot of commissions have been paid, and there's all kinds of frictional costs that are very real that somebody has paid to a bunch of people who facilitate this game. But whatever one group of the public has taken out, or one group of owners, has come in from other people. I mean, other people have entered the room and they've moved money around, but no money there's no more money in the room. It just changed hands with a lot of maybe fraud and costs involved, and a whole bunch of things. You lose, you forget the numbers or forget the equation. You can do that with a lot of things. I mean, it's been done throughout history. Certain things have value that don't produce something tangible. I mean, you can say a great painting, probably will have some value 500 years from now. May not, but the odds are pretty good that if it was a big enough name at some point, there will be a few things. I mean, you can find something. If somebody wants to sell you a pyramid or something, and you can charge the viewers, or it'll be around a long time and won't produce anything. But people will find it interesting to go there because I've read about the pyramids. But basically, assets, to have value, they have to deliver something to somebody, and there's only one currency that's acceptable in the United States. I mean, you can come up with all kinds of things. We can put up Berkshire coins, or we can put up Berkshire money or anything like that. But we get in trouble, I guess, if we call it money. But in the end, this is money, and there's no reason in the world why the United States government, whose currency people prefer, there's just under 2.3 trillion just of these little pieces of paper floating around some places, 7,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. And of course, most of them probably aren't in the United States. Who knows? But this is the only thing that's money. And anybody that thinks the United States is going to change to where they let Berkshire money replace theirs, is out of their mind. I mean, so anyway, with those few deficiencies, you can, whether it goes up or down in the next year or 5 years, 10 years, I don't know. But the one thing I'm pretty sure of is that it doesn't multiply, it doesn't produce anything. It's got a magic to it, and people have attached magics to lots of things. I mean, the gold on Wall Street, create magic. We are not an insurance company; we're a tech company. Well, they're an insurance company, but a dozen people or so have raised a lot of money. They just say, just don't pay any attention to the fact that we sell insurance. We are a tech company. Well, in the end, they wrote insurance, and overwhelmingly, they've lost a lot of money since then. You can make up things that work well and getting money from other people, and that's why.
Well, I have a slightly different way of looking at it.
I'll sell you something then.
Well, in my life, I try and avoid things that are stupid and evil and make me look bad in comparison with somebody else. And Bitcoin does all three. and in the first place, it's stupid because it's very likely to go to zero. The second place is evil because it undermines the Federal Reserve System and the national currency system, which we desperately need to maintain its integrity and government control and so on. And third, it makes us look foolish compared to the communist leader in China. He was smart enough to ban Bitcoin in China. And with all of our presumed advantages of civilization, we are a lot dumber than the communist leader in China.
Yeah, and when 25% of the people of the country get mad because we've said what we've said today, just remember Charlie spoke last and was the most. The one development that I really do think is actually important, but I don't know any way to do anything about it. But my general sense, and there's no way to prove it, but I essentially believe people are now behaving somewhat more tribal than they have for a long time. And I mean, people are always going to be partisan, and they're going to have religious beliefs, they're going to have all kinds of things, but it gets pretty tribal. And I want to tell you, I speak from experience because I've been tribal, and we're confessing today. Nebraska football is tribal. And when I watch a television set and I see our guys Nebraska step out of bounds by a foot, but somehow the ref misses it and calls it in, and then they show 6 replays, I'll continue to believe it was in, even though it's right in front of my eyes. They stepped out. That's tribal behavior. And it's fun. I mean, to participate in. But it can get very dangerous when one group of people say 2 + 2 is 5, and another say it's 2 + 2 is 3, and they're going to give you those answers if you call them. And the interesting thing is, to me, at least, and partly because of my age, but I actually think that, just from memory, that the last time that the country was seen as tribal was actually when I was a kid and Roosevelt was in. Either you hated Roosevelt or you loved him. I mean, nobody cared about the fact Alf Landon was running or Wendell Willkie was running against him. They just had these feelings. They either had Roosevelt's picture on the wall and named their kids after Roosevelt, or they hated him. And they thought he was going to, no third term, and a million things. And the country was very, very tribal in the 30s, but Roosevelt's tribe was bigger. And in my opinion, they did some wonderful things. But I happened to grow up in a household where we didn't get served dessert until we said something nasty about Roosevelt. I mean, I'm speaking. And believe me, if you don't get dessert, you're going to say something nasty about Roosevelt. And so you trained them young, and all kinds of things. And so I think I've seen a period that it wasn't that way when, if Eisenhower was running against Stevenson or whatever it might be. I mean, people, they had a partisan behavior, and they had a certain amount of tribal always, but I don't think it's a good development for society generally when people get tribal regardless. I mean, Charlie, what tribes are you a member of?
Well, in California, we have a legislature which is completely gerrymandered, so nobody can ever be thrown out by the voters. And therefore, the only people in the legislature are insane rightists and insane leftists. And they get together every 10 years, and there's usually 6 moderates somewhere in the legislature. And so they rejigger all the districts to throw them out, because neither party can stand them. Now, that is government in California.
Yeah. And you live there and you have to go back?
Yes, yes.
I'm sure you'll be welcome.
And I prefer living there to living in Russia.
Okay, who haven't we gotten in trouble with? Who was it, Lenny Bruce, that you say, is there anyone I've forgotten to offend? The Section 10, I believe.
Hello, Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger. My name is Sahej. I'm from New Jersey, and I'm currently a freshman at Rutgers University. You knew quite early on that you wanted to be investors, and you've obviously been amazing at it. What advice would you have for someone who's still trying to figure out what they want to focus on and find their calling?
Well, it is a very interesting question, because I was very, very lucky in that I found what I wanted to do, because my dad happened to be in a business that he wasn't interested in, but they had some books down there, and I loved my dad, and I'd go down and read the books, and they interested me. And, I'm glad he wasn't a professional boxer or something, or I wouldn't have any teeth left, or it was accident, just totally accident. But I do think you know it when you see it, and it doesn't mean you can follow. I would tell the students that wrote in the report, find out what you love doing it. You spend most of your life doing it, and why in the world would you want to be around for a lifetime working with people that you didn't like unless you had to, which sometimes happens, and just work for whomever you admire the most. And I gave the talk at Stanford one time, and somebody showed up at Tom Murphy's office, I think, a couple of days later. That person was right. And of course, it's what I did when I got out of school. I wanted to work for Ben Graham. I didn't care what I got paid. It didn't make any, it just is. I just knew that that's what I wanted to do. And then I pestered him for 3 years, and he finally hired me. And then I found somebody else that I'd even rather work for than Ben, who happened to be myself. And, so I've been working for myself ever since. But I had about 4 bosses in my life. I down the Lincoln Journal, name slips my mind at the moment. He's a wonderful boss. It was Cooper Smith at J.C. Penney's here in Omaha, and they all were wonderful people. But I still preferred working for myself. And of course, Charlie and I both worked for my grandfather, and we just didn't find it that interesting. I don't remember why'd you ever decide to go to work at the store, Charlie? Charlie worked there in 1940.
I worked just for the experience of working. I didn't need the money. My father gave me an ample allowance, and I also had a private business. So I was kind of working as a lark in your grocery store.
12 hours a day?
Yes.
For a lark?
Yeah, as a lark, yes.
Do you consider that a good investment of your time? I'm looking back on it.
Well, I'd never done it before, and I wanted to have a little of that experience, and I wasn't going to do it very long.
That sure as hell wasn't the reason I worked.
Well,
but
I could give that young lady the advice, figure out what you're bad at and avoid all of it.
Yeah.
That's the way Warren and I found our profession.
Absolutely. We
failed at everything else.
We worked at everything till we found the ideal employers ourselves. And that was something we really admired.
Yeah, I know. Warren said work for somebody you admire. The only one he knew was the one he was shaving.
Self-employed.
You see when he was shaving.
But it isn't bad advice. It isn't bad advice. I mean, who wants this? If they've got an option. I mean, if you're, Charlie went into the service in whatever year it was in the 40s, and he didn't really have a choice of who he was going to work for. And as I remember, it didn't really work out that well who you worked for, Charlie, did it?
Well, if you stop to think about it, there are two things that neither one of us has ever succeeded at. One, we've never succeeded at anything that didn't interest us, right?
Right.
And we've never succeeded at anything that was really hard where we didn't have much aptitude for it.
Yeah, and we've been doing whatever we please for 60 years now. I mean, and we get, we have fun in our way. And
I'm just amazed. You'd think if you're smart, you could do things that don't interest you well, but you can't.
Well, I've certainly got a lot of examples in my own case, but we won't get into them here. And we will go to Becky.
This question comes from Foster Taylor in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He said he recently listened to the Berkshire Hathaway 2008 annual meeting where you talked about global oil production. At the time, you talked about major ramifications if global oil production went below 85 million barrels in 25 years. We are at the 14-year mark and global oil production looks to be 79 million barrels. At the same time, we're depleting our strategic oil reserves. Should the United States be doing something differently, and do you see consequences to these actions in the next 10 years if we do not become more proactive?
Well, Charlie's the expert on oil.
Well, that
only compared to me.
Samuel Johnson said it's hard to determine the order of precedency between a louse and a flea. It's hard to tell which of us is more incompetent in oil.
Yeah, we're still competing.
I have a different view on this subject. I like having big reserves of oil. If I were running the benevolent despot of the United States, I would just leave most of the oil we have here and I'd pay whatever the Arabs charge for their oil, and I'd pay it cheerfully and conserve my own. I think it's going to be very precious stuff over the next 200 years. And nobody else has my view, so it doesn't bother me. I just think they're all wrong.
Yeah. Well,
but at any rate, that is not the normal view.
And we've been pretty flexible in our own view. I mean, actually, the federal government is serving up however many billion barrels of the stuff that into the economy. And it wasn't that long ago that the idea that anybody produced a barrel of oil was somehow something terrible. I mean, just try doing without 11 million barrels a day and see what happens tomorrow. It is something that everybody has a feeling on immediately, and this gets into a whole bunch of different tribes of sorts, and you offend an awful lot of people if you talk in any way about it. But in the end, I think at the moment, at least, most people feel that it's nice to have some oil in this country than not have it, and we're using a lot of it. And if we were to try and change over in 3 years or 5 years, nobody knows what would happen, but the odds that it would work well are extremely low, it seems to me. Charlie, why don't you say something more dramatic so you'll be the one that offended the most people?
Well, if you stop to think about it, the oil industry is being so vilified now. I can hardly think of a more useful industry, and I don't know about wildcatters, but certainly the petroleum engineers I know, and the people who design our oil refineries and pipelines are some of the finest and most reliable people I know. And I see very little trouble with the oil supply thing in the United States. So I'm basically in love with Standard Oil. And I don't have this feeling that it's an evil, crazy place. I wish the rest of the world worked as well as our big oil companies.
Well, we better move on to Station 11. I'm not sure whether Station 11 is operative.
Well, we're here.
Okay.
Greetings from the overflow room. My name is Glenn Tung. I'm a shareholder from New York. This is my 20th Berkshire annual meeting, and I'm delighted that we're able to once again be here in person. You two have brought tremendous joy to all of us through the years. And speaking personally, your wisdom has not only made me a better investor, but more importantly, a better, happier person. It's a privilege and honor to thank you. So Warren and Charlie, thank you.
Well, that's my kind of a question.
Yeah, that's fine.
Let's have more of those.
Yeah. Or you can say it again. I mean,
maybe you could sing it.
Maybe I should quit at this point.
Go ahead and go to it.
My question relates to share repurchases. Since you started buying back Berkshire shares in size 2 years ago, the repurchases have ranged between $1 billion and $3 billion per month. By my estimate, it appears that the buyback rate is about $3 billion per month when Berkshire's trading at a 20 or so % discount to intrinsic value, $2 billion per month at about a 10% discount, and $1 billion per month at a 0 to 10% value. Do I have that about right and approximately right? And do any other factors influence the rate of share repurchases?
Well, after you were so nice in your introduction, I have to say that, that you're actually wrong in our, if somebody had offered us $50 billion worth of stock at a certain point in the last 3 or 4, 5 months, we'd have taken it. You know, it's that simple. And as I mentioned earlier, we haven't bought any stock in April. It's something that when we can do it, and we know, at least we think the probabilities are very high. We certainly believe it in terms of our own evaluation and our own investment. We think that we're improving things for the remaining shareholder. We'll buy it back, and if we don't buy it back. And if we have the choice of buying businesses that we like or buying back stock, controlling factors how much money we have, we'd rather buy businesses. And so it isn't, you know, we don't stay awake at night working out formulas or anything of the sort. But we don't ever do it if we think that we're not doing something at the time. If we had a lemonade stand and Charlie and I and you owned it, and the lemonade stand was making us about $1 a week or something. And we divided it up, and you said you wanted to get out. And if you said one number, we'd have the funds in our little lemonade company, and we'd buy you out. And if we didn't like the price, we wouldn't buy you out. And it's the same way we feel. But we do feel an obligation to do things that we think are intelligent and in no way risk, absolutely no way present any risk of financial problems under any circumstances we can envision, except maybe something like nuclear war. We'll do it, but it never can be that big a factor. Certain companies, well, Charlie, I think, spoke the other day in connection with Henry Singleton. I think he bought back 89% of the company over time, and he sold stock like crazy, or issued it much earlier when it was overpriced, and he bought it back underpriced. But the key to that, of course, is having people think you're wrong in doing it. So he was able to buy a ton of it. And there's some other companies that have bought a ton of it. And Berkshire isn't going to get the chance to do that because if people think we're buying, we've got sensible shareholders, is what it amounts to. If we had the same group of shareholders that own two-day puts and they were our shareholders, we'd buy back the whole company, in a very short period of time. But it's such an easy concept to assess. I mean, the second stock I bought City Service Preferred. That was the first one. Second stock I bought was a company called Texas Pacific Land Trust. And that came out of the bankruptcy of the Texas and Pacific Railroad back in the 1880s or something like that. And they had 3 million some acres, and they owned the minerals, and they owned the surface and everything else. But it was terrible land in the 1880s. But they had some kind of a charter that said that use the proceeds from land sales, whatever it was, they were going to buy in stock every year. And I sat there when I was 13 or 14, and I figured if I lived to be 100, I would own the whole place. Well, I haven't lived to be 100 yet, and I wouldn't have bought the whole place. So both calculations are so far imperfect, but it's been a remarkable company, just plain remarkable, because they would talk about grazing fees of $6,000 a year or something like that, maybe when they had 3 million acres. And then they kept finding oil and more oil and more oil, and they've changed the form and all kinds of things, but they bought in stock week after week after week. And I sat there and figured out how long it would take until I owned the whole company. And I obviously made some improper calculations because it wouldn't have worked that way. But it still was apparent to me that it would be a very good idea if they had 3 million acres down there, that they got all through with it and they kept their mineral rights and all kinds of things, which they were doing. It ought to, at a very cheap price, it ought to work out well for anybody who sat around for a long time. And it has worked out extremely well for anybody who sat around a long time, but nobody knew that they were going to find a lot of oil, and that eventually El Paso would grow out far enough so that the surface lands became worth some money, that they were somewhat near El Paso. Then you had to go a couple of hundred more miles to find the next person, but that was another problem. So it's just so, some of the stuff is so simple, but people want to get their PhD or something, so they work out hundreds of pages and have lots of Greek letters in it and all that sort of thing. And either you're buying out your partner at an attractive price, or you're not buying them out at an attractive price. And if you got the money around to do it and the price is attractive, you don't have some other opportunities, why not? You got to come out ahead by doing it. And if you've got other things that are more intelligent, you don't do it. And And if it isn't intelligent on an absolute basis, you also don't do it. Charlie, have you got anything to add to the, what were you doing in 1943? You were in the service. And
Well, Warren, we'd be crazy if we didn't rather enjoy having come a considerable distance from small beginnings. And to do that in good company, it's a favored life.
Yeah.
We've been very fortunate.
Yeah. And tomorrow, Monday, I can tell you it's almost certain that if anybody offers us, well, there'll be shares trade of Berkshire and we won't buy any. But it's also a pretty fair chance someday a lot of shares, quite a few shares, not a lot. Berkshire's got our shareholders are too smart. That's one of our problems. If we want to repurchase shares. But we really don't want to squeeze it. We don't want to squeeze out anybody, but we also are here to do things that increase the value to the people who stick with us. I mean, it's not very complicated, and there'll be times when we'll do it, and there'll be times when we won't. But there won't be any formula, but there will be the principles that I've just expressed, and my guess is that my successor and their successor will have a similar calculation because we're looking for people that are rational and devoted to Berkshire. So
This question was sent in by Dave Shane from Brooklyn, New York. He's responding to something he heard earlier today. He said, in the future, will Greg be able to act with the same spontaneity that you mentioned earlier and make immediate multi-billion-dollar decisions without board approval?
well, my guess is that the board, it's just, they respond as people do. They'll put some more restrictions, or they'll have some more consultation on a lot of matters or some matters, than they do with me. I mean, they won't need to, but they'll feel that they haven't had the experience, they haven't seen them as long, and a whole bunch of things, and they'll feel that the Delaware laws protects them better. And incidentally, they don't have directors and officers liability insurance. I mean, virtually every company on the New York Stock Exchange has it, and we just don't buy it. I mean, come on the board and you're a trustee for a whole bunch of people that trust you and me. I'm talking about the directors and me. Fine, but it's very interesting. People go on museum boards, and they're expected to contribute. People go on college boards and they're expected to contribute money. And they say it's a great honor to be on a university board or museum board or whatever. It's a great honor, and therefore you should raise money for us. Well, frankly, I think our board's more interesting than being on a university board or a hospital board or something. I wouldn't know what they were talking about anyway, and on museum board or art board. So, but people have found that they can make $300,000 a year, which is way more, which is enormously important to some people and is meaningless to others. And I mean, the chances are, if somehow they'd arranged it so that directors didn't get paid at all, there'd be plenty of people who wanted to be directors, and there'd be a prestigious sort of thing and all that. But in effect, it's money that comes very easily. The whole idea of the independent director, frankly, it just doesn't really make any sense.
You don't think a director is independent who needs $300,000?
He needs the money. Yeah, I mean,
he's independent the way a slave is independent.
I am going to read a few sentences which are absolutely the case, except I'm doctoring. There's just I don't want anybody to be identified, obviously, with this. And these are word for word excerpts. I'm not telling you whether it's a woman or a man. I'm going to use a male pronoun because it's easier. But I picked out a few sentences from a letter I received many years ago. And this letter said, "I'm writing to you with a great deal of reluctance and a sense of personal embarrassment. I have tried all of the conventional means of raising the money." This person needed a couple $1 million. And I wouldn't have known the person if I saw him on the street. But it wrote this letter and said, "I need a couple $1 million." And then this is the item that I think you might find interesting. And I've kept the letter. "My income is composed 100% of my board fees." Well, I just looked him up, and at the time, he was a director of 5 prestigious companies, and had been directors of others, and he's going to be director of a whole bunch of things. But he was desperate for money, and he says he's getting 100% of it for board fees. And he was an independent director, classified as an independent director at every one of these companies. It's just astounding to me that we're going to have a shareholders meeting in just a couple of minutes. We're going to start it, and it's just astounding to me that in 2006 we owned 9% of the Coca-Cola company. I mean, maybe they gave me a free Coke. I mean, but we own 9% at Berkshire Hathaway. We obviously cared about the future of the Coca-Cola company, and it so happened in that year, CalPERS and a few others recommended that we be voted against for something or other, and at one time there were 2 big institutional investors that voted because they didn't think I was independent, because Dairy Queen bought some Coca-Cola, or actually the people that had our franchises bought some Coca-Cola. I mean, do they think I can't add things and if we've got billions and billions and billions of dollars that I'm going to be compromised? But it's just nutty. And so one year my vote fell from 96%, yeah, maybe it was 98% vote approval to 84% because I forget whether it's 2004, 2000, somewhere along the line, they just decided that I wasn't the right sort of person to be able to handle these responsibilities. And the idea that somebody, it's an important part of their income. I mean, what they want, they may want to do a lot of other good things. It doesn't mean they're terrible people. But if the difference is whether how you live, and in this case, whether the person might go broke, how in the world you can call somebody like that independent and say that anybody owns a lot of, maybe Walter Scott's, not independent, or maybe it's just ridiculous. But it's the way the rules are, and we follow the rules. But
well, they don't want them just independent now. They want one horse, one rabbit, one cow, one whatever. I mean, I feel like Galileo. Independence is not enough. You got to have a very diverse kind of independence.
Yeah. And if you desperately need the money, in this case, 100% of the income coming from it, you're on 5 of the most prestigious boards in the country, and classify as independent on each and other, and all you're hoping is that.
Well, I think
your CEO gets called
We can
by another
safely-
CEO and says, "Is this guy okay?" And you say, "Of course he's okay," which means, of course, he doesn't cause trouble, and so he gets on a sixth board. Anyway,
I know. All I say is it's not our idea of an independent director.
no, it's all a little crazy, which brings us to the fact that we're now going to have our annual meeting here, and about 15 minutes we'll reconvene at 3:45, and then we'll do the business of the meeting that is required, and you're all welcome to stay, and it's very. Okay, turn up the lights.
Thus ends the afternoon session of this year's Berkshire Hathaway
Thanks everyone
meeting.
for tuning in.
Warren Buffett and Charlie
we'll
Munger
keep
just
this going
finishing
for a few more
second
minutes and then
3-hour
probably shut off the
session, talking to
broadcast.
shareholders, taking
Let me
questions.
see here.
In about
Thanks
15
again,
minutes, the formal
for
business
joining.
meeting
Thanks, Jack.
will
Appreciate it.
begin. The shareholder meeting.
Thanks,
We will
Aries, for
take
the
you there
feedback.
when
Master
it
Chief,
happens.
meow
Becky
to
will
you
be
as
back with us shortly
thanks,
as well.
everybody. Please
CNBC.com's
subscribe.
Hugh
We
Son
are
is
covering
back with us
space,
too. We'll get to him.
finance and
Actually,
startups.
let's just talk about
I'm
some
a
of
bit
the
of a different
headlines
YouTuber
that
because
were
I've been
generated in the
operating,
last couple of
in highly
hours here.
successful
Hugh, for
companies,
one thing,
since
we find out that
1999.
Warren Buffett himself
So
had
my
decided
perspective
to
is
take
gonna
a
be quite a
fairly
bit
large
different
stake in Activision
when it comes
after
to
the
what we're
Microsoft deal to
tracking here in
acquire the
terms
company
of,
was
I'm an
announced,
investor in space
9.5%
tech right
or so
now.
position. That's
I have a
clearly
fund in my own
as
family
he
office.
described it, virtually an
Finance
arbitrage.
related to
Basically, just a
stocks.
bet
We'll
that
be
the deal gets
covering
closed,
earnings reports,
presents a nice return,
annual
cash
general
return,
meetings
if in
like
fact
this
that
with
deal happens.
Warren and
And
friends.
then, of course, a lot of
And then
comments on
also, if you
inflation,
are building
really
a
just
company
saying so much
and
money
are
being
tired
thrown into
of
the economy seems to be behind this,
crap you're basically
this
listening
rush
to
of
on TikTok
inflation.
and YouTube,
Warren
related to
Buffett
actually building
saying
a business
that
with
it needed
serious
to be
cash
done,
flow.
most likely, but this
Feel
is
free to
one of
reach
the
out. We're going
results.
to be
And then
covering
finally,
that
Hugh,
specifically over the
some
next week. We'll be
relatively
covering
sharp edge comments as
how to
we've come to
continue to
expect
build
on
a
crypto,
cash flow business
including Warren Buffett saying he
an
wouldn't
environment like a
buy all
recession.
the
So
Bitcoin in the world
we're
if
going to
you
get to the
offered it to
nitty
him for
gritty of
25
things.
bucks.
Yeah, Mike,
That's
really
about
curious
it. Looks
because I
like
would
Jack
take it
is
for
going to run and get a
$25.
pizza and come back.
So
Sounds
you know,
good.
he likes productive
Fernando,
assets.
thanks a lot.
He likes farmland. You know, he likes.
Are we going to hold the
equities with
meeting? Yeah,
dividends,
we're
that type of thing.
going to end the broadcast and
on
then
the
come
other hand,
back.
he
I'd like
holds
to
more than
save
100
this
billion cash.
to the YouTube channel
Now, when
and
it comes
come
to
back.
money,
So
he only thinks
we'll be back
you know,
in a
the
little
green
bit.
papers money.
Thanks everybody.
So that's,
Please
I think,
subscribe.
you know,
It does
his
help.
sort of
I don't want to
rigid
be one of those guys
worldview
talking
is
about
no surprise to
subscribing,
anybody. He's
but
called
unfortunately,
a rat
that's the way it
poison
is here.
squared.
In order for us
You know,
to
Munger
just get
thinks
some
it's
traction,
evil and
get our
go to
URL
zero.
and get
I
things
think
going.
those are
So
some of the headlines
thanks
today.
again.
So no surprise
We'll see
from
you guys
these
in a
two
few
that they
minutes here.
haven't changed
I'm going to
their
end the
view.
broadcast and we'll come back
However,
shortly.
you know, just really quickly, I mean, the U.S. is not going to pull China and ban Bitcoin and ban crypto. That's pretty clear. And so I would argue that their view on crypto is, you know, is overly rigid at this point in the game.
Well, and actually, by admission to a degree, because Warren kept joking that, you know, a quarter of the people out there are going to take offense and hate them for these comments. So there's some recognition that they're out of tune with this part of the markets, if you want to consider them part of the overall markets, but that it just simply doesn't conform to any definition of either a productive asset or a cash instrument that is, you know, sanctioned by a government and where you can pay your taxes with.
Yeah, look, I mean, we're in the process of determining that. You know, clearly, you know, Biden has, you know, a task force that, you know, is you know, tasked with, you know, creating a regulatory framework where this is actually going to be something that they, you know, discuss over the years. You know, on the other hand, you know, look at the other headlines. You know, he's talked about inflation, you know, the pervasive nature of its impact on stocks, bonds, the ability for the companies to you know, be productive and earn a margin. You know, I would say that the real takeaway, you know, you look at the full, you know, scope of what he said, there isn't a lot of new news here. And at the same time, not a lot of, you know, bullish discussions about what the economy is doing this year. He's obviously always bet big on the U.S. economy over the long term. What he's been a little bit more mum on is, you know, sort of the short term and near term prospects of companies during a time of high inflation, of increasing costs, and increasing pressures on everybody from, you know, consumers to businesses, you know, to investors. So, you know, I really think that, you know, you take a look at this and, you know, if you look at this discussion a year or two in the future, you might think that, potentially he sees storm clouds on the horizon and doesn't really want to dwell on that too much.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, pretty much a shortage of direct economic color about the outlook. We do, though, have the specific soundbite of what was said about crypto. Why don't we hear that now?
Whether it goes up or down in the next year or 5 years, 10 years, I don't know. But the one thing I'm pretty sure of is that it doesn't multiply, it doesn't produce anything. It's got a magic to it, and people have attached magics to lots of things.
In my life, I try and avoid things that are stupid and evil and make me look bad in comparison with somebody else. And Bitcoin does all three. and in the first place, it's stupid because it's very likely to go to zero. The second place is evil because it undermines the Federal Reserve System and the national currency system, which we desperately need to maintain its integrity and government control and so on. And third, it makes us look foolish compared to the communist leader in China. He was smart enough to ban Bitcoin in China. And with all of our presumed advantages of civilization, we are a lot dumber than the communist leader in China.
We do have Becky back with us. And interestingly, Warren actually went a step further and attributed some of the allegiance to Bitcoin to an increasing tribalism in the country.
Right.
And essentially, it's my team. I believe in Bitcoin. And if you're against it, I'm against you, in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's a fair point to it. I think he was speaking much more broadly than just Bitcoin. But you're right. He used that as a jumping off point for getting into that. And it's particularly interesting because he went out of his way to say that he didn't want to get political on things. Really, in past years, they've commented much more broadly on issues like taxes. In fact, I was surprised. I had questions ready to go, a lot of them on taxes. He said right before I was going to ask that question that he didn't want to get into it. I gave it a try anyway, and Charlie weighed in very briefly. But they insulted a lot of people, knowing that they did it. Everybody, I think you mentioned probably some, not just Bitcoin, oil reserve, anybody who's attacking oil companies, some of the activists who are out there, talked about the passive index funds. They managed to insult a lot of people. But I think they were being a little more careful to not get political, like very overtly so. And it's the first time I remember in a long time where they really didn't stray into much from Washington.
Not much at all in terms of policy, for sure. And they seem content to just say there are extremes on both sides. That's a divide that's not helpful. But there wasn't a lot of position taking within it.
Not at all. And I mean, and that's different. I mean, I think he's edged away from politics over the last few years, and I think the tribalism answer is an explanation as to why. So, it threw me for a loop. I had a lot of questions lined up and planned, and I had to reshuffle as he was saying some of these things going through the meeting because it was not entirely what I anticipated or expected. We did hear him talk about Activision, the one point where he was breaking news, trying to just tell us that this is a position that he's actually been taking. This was something, again, caught the room by surprise. He said he wanted to make some news. So he told the shareholders, everybody in the room, that while it was one of the other managers who was originally buying Activision before the deal got announced, after the deal got announced, he was doing it, and he was doing it for arbitrage reasons. Listen in.
One of the things I bought was bought for a different purpose by a different manager months earlier. He bought roughly 15 million shares of Activision. And I never paid, I knew about the company, but I would just see it at the monthly report. But then on January, 17th or 18th, something like that, Microsoft announced they were going to buy Activision for $95 a share. Now, when they announced that, at that point, Activision becomes a different kind of security.
Okay, so this is interesting. In the